In October 1962, a Soviet submarine drifted in the waters off Cuba. Inside, the temperature was rising, oxygen was low, and depth charges were exploding. The captain, believing war had already begun, ordered the launch of a nuclear-armed torpedo. One officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to authorize the strike. His single veto stopped a chain reaction that would have resulted in global thermonuclear war. How did the world arrive at this precipice? 17 years earlier, the Third Reich had collapsed. As Allied forces converged on Berlin from the east and the west, the traditional European powers lay in ruins, leaving a massive geopolitical vacuum across the continent. At the Yalta Conference, the victors, Joseph Stalin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, gathered to carve up the post-war map. Germany and Berlin were divided into 4 occupation zones by the US, Britain, France, and Soviet Union. Notice, Berlin was deep inside the Soviet sector. With fascism defeated, the alliance dissolved. The 3 Western zones consolidated, drawing a sharp border against the Soviet East. The destruction of the traditional European powers left 2 continental empires in their place, guaranteeing a systemic collision between their opposing visions of human organization. The United States organized its society around market capitalism, private property, and multi-party democracy. The Soviet Union enforced direct state control of all economic production and a single-party political monopoly. By 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill publicly declared that an Iron Curtain had descended, splitting the European continent from the Baltic to the Adriatic. To counter Soviet expansion, U.S. President Harry S. Truman formalized a policy of global containment. The goal was to provide political and military assistance to any nation facing authoritarian pressure. The U.S. injected billions into Western Europe through the Marshall Plan, while SIPRI data tracks parallel rising Soviet military expenditures. Viewing this as encroachment, Stalin retaliated in 1948. He blocked all land access to West Berlin to starve the Western towers out. The Western Allies responded by supplying the city from the sky. For nearly a year, American and British cargo planes flew into Berlin, delivering up to 13,000 tons of food and fuel every single day. Because open warfare carried the risk of absolute destruction, logistics, economics, and blockades became the primary weapons of global dominance. The weapons race accelerated. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. 3 years later, the United States detonated Ivy Mike, a multi-megaton hydrogen device. This created a mathematical certainty known as mutually assured destruction. If either superpower launched a nuclear strike, the retaliatory strike would guarantee the annihilation of both nations. Unable to confront each other directly, Washington and Moscow channeled their competition into surrogate proxy conflicts. In 1950, this dynamic fueled the outbreak of the Korean War. For decades, the superpowers poured weapons, money, and military advisors into local conflicts across the globe. This strategy drained the resources of both empires, culminating in protracted campaigns like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Avoiding a direct clash between the superpowers came at the price of millions of deaths in localized, hot conflicts spanning the globe. The competition extended far beyond terrestrial battlefields. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, proving they possessed the ballistic missile technology to reach space. The Soviets maintained this lead when Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the planet in 1961. The United States answered 8 years later, landing Apollo 11 on the moon and planting the American flag in the lunar soil. While rockets launched overhead, a clandestine war played out in the shadows. Intelligence agencies cultivated networks of informants, attempting to infiltrate civilian populations and steal state secrets. The enemy was already inside. In 1953, American citizens Julius and Ethel Rosenbrunn were executed for running a spy ring that provided the Soviet Union with classified atomic data. State leaders fueled this domestic paranoia. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev famously told Western diplomats, "We will bury you," an ideological claim of historical victory that was interpreted in the West as a direct military threat. This standoff dictated the content of mass media, from government-sponsored duck-and-cover propaganda in American schools to Soviet art promoting collective labor and communist solidarity. These instruments turned the conflict into an inescapable psychological campaign, pressuring citizens on both sides to demonstrate absolute domestic loyalty. Beneath the surface, the Soviet command economy was stagnating, unable to sustain the massive military expenditures required to match Western advancements. This structural weakness was compounded by a global oil glut. A sudden collapse in energy prices devastated the petroleum export revenues that Moscow relied upon to fund its state apparatus. In an attempt to save the system, Mikhail Gorbachev assumed leadership in 1985 and initiated radical political and economic reforms. For nearly 30 years, the reality of the Soviet system had been physically manifested in the Berlin Wall, a heavily fortified concrete barrier flanked by a deadly no-man's land designed to prevent citizens from fleeing to the west. On November 9, 1989, a policy shift regarding travel restrictions prompted thousands of East Berliners to mass at the border crossings. The guards, lacking clear orders and overwhelmed by the crowds, opened the gates. Civilians flooded through, climbing onto the concrete and physically dismantling the barrier. The Soviet system imploded under its own weight, succumbing to economic exhaustion and the total erosion of its founding ideology. By December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved into 15 independent republics, ending the 45-year conflict. Humanity emerged from the struggle through a combination of deterrence and fortune. However, the automated command structures and thousands of nuclear warheads engineered for that confrontation remain active today, a massive, world-ending architecture awaiting a new spark.